I didn't have it all set up like I often do. Here we are. I'm turning off all the other things. And I'm lighting a candle because I like to do that. It has meaning for me. Ah, I broke it. So, and only those of you who join after, like, you know, at the replay, get to see this part. It's special. It's just between me and you. The people that come for the replay, you don't, come in and afterwards. And maybe not at all. The topic today is grief. If you're here, say hi. I like to not be alone. Makes it a lot easier for me. Grief. And grief is a skill set. I always pull that up. This has kind of become a series that I'm doing during this launch. And I think this is the 4th or 5th one. I don't know. If I was more strategic or more prepared, then I would, have like part 1, part 2. I'd probably have hashtags or some shit. But I don't. That's not really how it goes. I have been incredibly grateful to have the capacity to do these lives this week, because there was almost an entire year of my life I didn't have the capacity at this time. Hi, Anthony. This evening, at this time of the evening, I was really done being, interacting. And now, hi, Rosik. That usually happens around 7:30, around 7:30 in the evening. It's like, oh, the Ladegottsue. I don't know how you say, and in Switzerland, we have these shutters on the outside of windows, right? And that you close at night. And so my shutters just close and that's it. Hi, Max. This is really strange. This is telling me there's nobody here, but there clearly are people here. I'm fascinated by the whole technology. So today, I will specifically be talking about grief. I have in the other ones, and I can't tell you which one, whether it was yesterday or 2 days before, or the day before that, but in the other videos in the series, I have talked about care, I've talked about trust, I've talked about deconstructing blame, shame, and guilt, and a myriad of other ones. This one today will be focused, everything's included, on grief. And why it's one of the foundational skill sets that I teach. So there's 6 foundational skill sets. They lie the foundation for the learning of all other skill sets that I teach. They are necessary. And therefore, anything I teach, for me, always begins with these 6 skill sets. And grief, I believe, is the 3rd skill set of the 6 foundational skill sets. And people often ask me, why grief is a skill set? Because it's just a normal human experience. I'm like, is it? I agree. I think it is the most innate, necessary, emotional experience that we have as human beings. But it's just been horrifically and atrociously suppressed and oppressed for many, many generations, to the point that people who look like me and live where I live in Switzerland, have lost ritual, ceremony, because of the way that everybody was colonized and assimilated. My people don't exist anymore. Not in culture, not in beliefs, not in connection, not in food. I don't know who my people are. And that has been happening on repeat in history. War, conquer, assimilate, don't allow time for grief or to reconnect. So it's just war and conquer over and over and over and over again until grief goes underground. there's no room for real, authentic grief. Hi, Catherine. There's no room for the screaming, aching, weeping, sobbing grief. There's no room for the human grief. There's just some shell of the idea of what grief is. And it's given a very tiny time limit in the Western world. And so it had to go deep, deep underground. Anyone with indigenous roots will still have connection to this, much more than I did. And what I also realized is when people started practicing the skill sets that I teach, of care, of deconstructing blame, shame, of guilt, of coming face to face with this Western-minded thinking, with dysfunction, with abuse, with the violence or trauma in their own past, and the oppression and suppression internally that's holding it down begins to expand and move away, a whole lot of grief comes up. A whole lot of grief. Your own unmetabolized grief, your lineage's unmetabolized grief, a lot of grief for that which was stolen, that which is missing, that which it's like a longing for something you never even knew existed. Grief is about loss, so a lot of loss. And it starts to come really through when you start to build skill sets inside yourself for stability and safety. And it started to come in a lot. And then my dad died. So my dad died in 2018, and I had the opportunity to meet grief completely unfettered, completely undysfunctional, completely real, completely raw, completely alive, completely life-altering. And I had to choose it. I had to choose it over and over and over again, because there was a cruelty in my mind still at that point about what I was experiencing and if I was even allowed to be experiencing it. And I just kept ripping the things off that were like, no, you can't, no, you shouldn't. And I just kept letting grief move through me. Did your stuff all just stop as well? I get screwed. I mean, if this happens, I can't work. No, don't turn it. Please do not. I turned it off and back on. Okay. Hello, if you're still here, thank you so much. Hi, friend. I had to go make sure. It went off for a minute. Thank you for sticking with me, for staying with me. Back on, and now it went off again. Turn it back on. It's going to take a minute. I have no idea. Oh, there we go. I'm here. I'll just pick my nose and think anybody's here. If you're still here, hi, Fran. Hi, Polly. Hi, Frank. There's been some technical difficulties. Let's hope that was the end of it. I hope that was the end of it. My computer's having problems. If you're still here, could you wave or say something to me that this is working for you? Is this working for you? Oh, my phone went to 5G. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you, phone, and phone whatever that I pay for to make that happen. So something's happening with the Wi-Fi in the house. Thank you. So I was on a roll, and now let's start over. Or not, or just go back. So it's, today I'm talking about the skill set of grief and why it needs to be a skill set. Hi, Allie. Why I talk about it that way, right? And one of the reasons is that it's been suppressed and oppressed for centuries of our experience. And when my dad died in 2018, I came face to face with grief in the unfolding of it that was not dysfunctional, that I released all constructs about what grief is, what it should be, what it should look like, and I just allowed myself to grieve. And in that process, I realized the people around me had no idea about grief. That those that did know about grief had gone through tremendous loss. But that we were not literate as a community or culture or society or village where I live on grief. Switching back over to Wi-Fi. So we're not literate. People don't know what to say. People don't know what to do. People don't know how to grief that is very callous, that is very inhumane, that just doesn't make any sense. And that is because grief has been so suppressed and so oppressed and so poo-pooed and so, in a really, really sense, beaten out of us, killed out of us, having to face tragedy after. Okay. Okay. I think if you're watching this later, you might not get all those glitches. But I appreciate you guys staying with your attention. Hi, Jennifer, and being here with me as the glitches happen. I was just sitting going, am I going to have to let this one go today? Maybe, grief doesn't want to be talked about out loud on the ethers. I highly doubt it. She's a beauty. She's not trying to be hidden. Hi, Victoria. Grief. And so we don't have cultural societal practices anymore. Not as a whole together. We don't have a value set around it that we can all depend on. We are illiterate. We are deeply unexposed. Grief is hidden and kept out of awareness, and if anyone's too loud, if anyone has grief for too long, they're the problem. It's not that grief is moving and grief needs to move and it's natural and we all need to feel that. It's that you're a problem if you should just get over that now. You can never get over what you lose. Grief is the appropriate response to losing someone or something you love. Grief is the way we love our people into death, how we love them as they go wherever they go next. Grief is the tremendous capacity to love. It is a deep capacity for appreciation of life. It is so unbelievably powerful and necessary and needed and innate and human. But because it's been suppressed and we are not taught about it and we have no combined communal, global, even in your own country, maybe even in your own county, in your own village where you live, we don't have any culture around grief. So it's a skill set at first. We have to reteach ourselves. What is grief? We have to relearn in our bodies. This is grief. I grieve. I carry grief for a lot of things. But I have been grieving my childhood since I was a child. And those are the things that I started to recognize. Oh, that is what this feeling is. I am grieving that. I'm grieving my childhood. I carry an immense amount of grief because of my trauma, because of what's happened to me, because of all the things. And if I don't actively cultivate my relationship to grief and learn what grief has to show me, then grief doesn't live in my awareness. So I have to cultivate a relationship with grief in today's day and age, the world we live in order to understand that grief is innate and natural and normal and necessary part of being a human being. And grief would end violence in a day. if it was not suppressed, if it was given space to live in every single human being exactly as it does, without dysfunction or abuse or oppression or suppression of it, it would end a lot of things. But there's, centuries of unmetabolized grief in humanity. Centuries of grief illiteracy by design. By design. Intact culture around grief, if you've never been around it, will take you to your knees. It will blow your entire being wide open. It will stun you into your humanity. If you ever get the chance to have the experience within a culture that is still immensely grief literate, it can change your life. And it can do more for you than anything I know. And there are intact grief cultures with intact grief, culture around grief in the world today. Thank God. We'd all be lost if they did not exist. Hi, Ingrid. So if you're here and you are having questions around grief, and I can help you with them, like if it's something I respond to, I would love to. It's transformative and humbling and the most human thing I've ever experienced in my life. And not just that, I call grief the mother of all emotions, because it's within the grieving process, there's humor and joy and laughter, immense sadness. There is, the veil drops and a lot of knowing and understanding becomes available. It places you right in the center of your humanity. And grief can break your heart open. Yes, that's exactly what it is, opening. There's no heart closing. I'm not heartbroken. My heart is just opening further and wider and broader than I ever thought was possible, than I've ever been told was possible. My humanity lies in my grief and my ability to grieve. And my ability to be with others as they grieve and not take one single step towards trying to fix their grief or fix them or make them stop what they're doing in their grief. In knowing how to be with others in grief. That's the skill set. And I'm going to tell you, it's far more natural than you think. We just haven't been taught. Or the knowledge has been taken from us and hidden from us. Or it was taken and then whoever took it, back when they took it, they forgot about it too. By design. But grief can change your life. And many people are carrying grief they haven't acknowledged. They don't even know it's there. They just kept going when something happened. There's people that I work with that Megan might pioneer a lot of this work or reintroduction of it. I've never heard of her. I will have to go and look that up. Look her up. Not that. It's a person. No, never heard of her. And I'm glad. Like, it's important work and it needs to be in the world. And it's a really important skill set in the work of being a mature human being in the world. Because whether you know it or not, in your lifetime as an adult, you are going to meet grief. If you haven't already as a child. And you're going to be and care about people who are going through grief. And so how do we hold each other in that grief without placing any of our own shit on somebody, without needing somebody to change so we don't feel uncomfortable, without placing any kind of burden on them, knowing how to treat people when they're in grief, how to care for them, how to not ask them too many questions and know what to deliver that is caring and not needing a pat on the back when we do it, but knowing how to show up for that. And sometimes people will be going through the skill sets and their awareness and their skill set and grief is increasing, and then something will happen. They're driving and a bug hits their windshield and they burst out in tears for the death of that bug. And they're like, I don't understand what's happening. you know? Well, what's happening is grief is finally liberated. And all the metabolized grief that you have, this catalyst of the bug dying and your grief for the loss of that bug at your hand, is allowing that grief to finally move in your body, finally move through who you are. And it's just going to find whatever window, whatever portal, whatever door that you open, and it's going to come through. And it's going to purify you in a way into more of who you are. Not less, but more of you. Grief doesn't take from you, it gives to you. It gives to you. It's vitally important that we teach our children about grief literacy. Not that they should have grief, but how do you sit with somebody in grief? Because I realized my children were all under 16 years old when my dad died, and they had no idea. They'd never seen anybody in grief. My oldest child had made it to 16 years old. He had been, that's how hidden grief is. That's how this nebulous way that we live, where we're like these nuclear families and these households inside, we don't know what's going on with anybody else. That's really, really strange and inhumane. And having to teach my people who love me, including my husband, including myself, for fuck's sakes, including myself, what it was that I needed in my grief was a bit mind-blowing. In the grief that I was in, I had to find the place to educate myself and to educate my family and the people that love me. And it was not super clean. It was messy. My husband had, he was a kayak instructor, one of the most dangerous recreational sports of all time. And he had been planning this kayak trip with a bunch of people. He was going to teach for a year. And it just so happened that that kayak trip was like 5 days after my dad died. And he's like, okay, so should I stay home? And I'm like, no. Mind you, I've never been in the kind of grief that I was. I didn't know. And he was like, okay, you sure? I'm like, yeah. And of course, I'm an adult. He's an adult. We trust each other. I said, sure. He packs himself up and he goes. And in that kind of grief, I was not supposed to be responsible for anyone. Not for anyone. Responsible for the caretaking for anyone, let alone all the meals and the caretaking that you do as a mom without a partner. I should never have been left alone. And I found myself 3 o'clock in the morning in my PJs halfway down my street. Just walked out the front door, walked down the street in an altered state, because that's what grief is. I was like, yeah, I can't be alone right now. And I walked back home and went back to sleep and got up the next morning and I called my husband. And I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my whole life. The hardest thing, one of the hardest things in a relationship I have ever done. And I said, I need you to come home. And I burst into tears and I wept. I know what it meant. He was going to have to give everything back to the other instructor. He was going to have to pack up all his stuff. He was going to, all the things he had planned to do. I knew what that was going to mean. And I still said, I need you to come home. I'm sorry. I didn't know that I needed you to stay home. I need you to come home. And he was like, okay. That moment with my husband was very healing. Because even though we'd never been through something like this, we were grief illiterate, we both could feel how deeply important what I was going through was teaching both of us. And so he said, okay, it's going to take me 5 hours, pack up all the things, arrange another instructor, and drive home. I said, okay. Maybe it was even 6 hours, I don't remember. And I remember sitting at the table, and my 16-year-old son came home, and he had heard from his dad that I'm on my way home, and he comes in and he slams the door. Now, I love my children. They are the most amazing humans. I love them I can't even explain how much I love them. Like, there are no words. And my 16-year-old son comes in and he slams the door 5 days after my dad died. And he's like, Dad's coming home. Why is Dad coming home? This is totally unfair. This is absolute bullshit. And I remember sitting at the table being like, oh my God. Right? Now remember, I'm wide open with grief. Like, it is what I am. There is no division between me and grief. I just am grief. Grief has a lot of grace. Grief has so much to give. So much to give. And so he was in his apprenticeship at the time, and he was all muddy. And I said, why don't you go take a shower and then come back and sit with me at the table, but go shower, get home. And he came out of the shower and said, okay, son of mine, love of my heart, please sit down for a second. And he's like, has this attitude, and he's like really angry. And I said, I just looked across at him and said, my dad died 5 days ago. He's like, yeah, I know. And I said, in all your anger about Dad having to come home, where am I? Where's this grief that I have? Where are your thoughts? Where am I? What's happening to you that you're not considering me in this? And we had a long conversation because he didn't know better. I'd never taught him any different, but I did then. This is how you are going to be with me in my grief. Even at 16 years old, this is the responsibility that you're going to hold with me in my grief. So when my husband came home, all the kids started doing laundry. They started taking care of the household. We set up things about like, how do we take care of Mom? Now, my children did not have a connected relationship to my dad. It doesn't mean they didn't have grief, but it was, they didn't relate in the same way, right? They'd seen him once in their whole life. So they had the sadness of me being in my grief, but they didn't have the like relational grief that I was experiencing. So we just came up with these ways of like sometimes I would just stop what I was doing. Like I'd be in the middle of something. There were so many times they found like laundry that I was supposed to hang up in the basket. I would put things in weird places. It's an altered state, that grief. And we just talked to them to take care of it. Whatever Mom doesn't leaves, take care of it. Do not be unkind to her. Do not throw it in her face. Do not, try to get me to remember, or, oh my God, you're so, out of it. None of that. It's understanding for where I am. And they asked, well, how long? And I said, I don't know. I don't know. But I know that I am here and I am active and I am fully aware of you guys and the relationship. And I'm everywhere else too. Grief, I am grief. And I am everywhere else too. And I needed to get out in nature. And I needed to be in the water. And I met a teacher of mine at that time through his books by the name of Martin Brechtel. And that really did a lot. That educated me on grief. He has a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust. And it is all about grief. And it was a great education and nourishment for me at that time in my life. And that's when I really started to see how to learn and educate myself on what guilt too, but grief is, and how to educate the people around me about my grief at the same time that I am fully in it, right? At the same time that I have to have so much understanding for the inhumanity and the callous reactions of people. At the same time, I was overwhelmed by everybody being like, what can I do for you? And I'm like, I don't even remember my middle name. I don't know. What can I do for you? And some of it was genuine. People wanted to help. And some of it was just people wanting to look like they could help. And fuck if grief doesn't let you see that clearly. You see agendas and you see where people are full of shit. And you don't have it anymore. You don't have the filter to be able to be like understanding about it. She's like, no, you just have to keep going. And I was like, at least in my world, the people I know, we are grief illiterate. But there were people that had like innate understanding. My best friend was a refugee in the Bosnian War. And she has had a life. And when my dad died, she called me every single day. And we have a huge time difference. And we, like nowadays, if we talk once a month, we did good. And we love each other. But when my dad died, she called me every day for 3 months. Every single day, she called me for 3 months. Every single day. She taught me a lot about how to be with others in their grief. I also had a best friend from my childhood who, very sporadic that we talk, who also showed up very much for me in that time and in ways that other people didn't, right? That was abnormal and rare and needed and beautiful. And I learned so much from the people that held me. I recently finished my unpublished book. Good job, Anthony. That's a whole lot of investment and time and energy and emotions and self and being that you have completed. Give me a high five. And I realized listening is about the little boy grief through the years. Like, yeah. Yeah. And in that grief of my father, I began to realize I have been carrying unmetabolized grief. And I allowed the grief of myself and my ancestors and everything to come through. I'm like, whatever. I'm an open portal right now. Let's metabolize the shit out of this. I'm not saying anyone should do that. Anyone. I'm not saying that's what anybody should do. It's just what I chose to do. And it brought a deep, deep, deep education to me. And also, how do I facilitate this as a skill set for others? Became very clear from the inside. I understood what it was from the inside. I had to re-aliven culture around grief in my body, in my environment, with my people. And that can't go away. And I can give that in every moment of my life. And so that's where that module of my skill set workshops came to be from. Came out of every single module that I teach is my own experience, is an embodied live experience that I have. And if I could, I would pour it into everybody. I'd be like, look here, but I can't. I can only point in a non-linear storytelling kind of way that grief is so important. And if you have grief, that you're feeling grief, that there is a way for you to cultivate a relationship with that is, grief is not destabilizing. This is such a fallacy. It is such a bullshit lie we've been told. There's stories that I've heard and read about like people like, lamenting or in the Western world, in America, and like just crying for 6 hours at a funeral, and they called the ambulance. In the cultures in the world that still have a grief culture, days are spent on the grief and the funeral and the verabschied, the goodbye and the farewell and I just recently was at a funeral in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and they said, one of the last assignments of their ancestors who die, one of their last assignments is to help their whānau, their people, their family, grieve their loss. That's grief culture. Grief is purposeful. Grief is necessary. Grief is what makes us whole. And grief is what makes us human. And when we are not allowed to grieve for any reason, we're pushed into, tragedy. War is a place that war and assimilation and tragedy like this that just keeps happening, and people don't have time to grieve. They don't have the space to grieve. They don't have the dignity to grieve. That grief gets unmetabolized. That's been happening for centuries. And so, by design, creates disease, all kinds of things. So it, like that wide openness that grief is, that it needs to be, is obliterated over and over. So it doesn't get the chance to move through the body as it needs to move through the body. We don't honor our dead. In the Western world, in my world, the dead are not honored. And I was in a position, I was actually teaching a course, and I continued to teach it. I think it was like the end. It was like 3 weeks, 2 weeks left. I continued to teach, taught it, and then I didn't work for 5 months. And that's how long it took me to, the grieving never ends. It doesn't stop. But that was like, after 5 months for me, and I'm not saying this if it takes 18 months, 3 years, 5 years, that's what it takes for somebody to feel like they've come. This is the fucked up words as I'm saying them. I'm like, what am I trying to say? You don't ever function the same way because your grief changes you. But 5 months until I didn't come out the other side. I didn't complete my grief, but it felt like what needed to be metabolized had been metabolized. And I, could do the laundry and the meal plans and not leave that shit around and forget it and things like that. And so sometimes when you start to recultivate your relationship with grief, a big flood of it will come, and it will come for a long time. And it will keep coming. And you will know exactly what to do because it's innate. And you will know exactly how to hold it. You will know exactly how to ask people for help because it will be flowing in the conjunction with a whole bunch of other skill sets that allows you to feel your grief in a way that you understand that it's safe for you to do so, right? That's another thing grief needs. It needs safety. It needs space and time and ceremony and safety to really, truly be given life inside of us. And that just hasn't been given for millennia. 4 millennia, especially in the white Western world. Especially the white Western world. Grief is seen as like a nuisance. There's no time for that. It's not productive. So I had all the time here to take, and my siblings live in the United States. They had 3 days. So my dad died, and his wife decided to do the funeral a month later to give me time to be able to get on a plane and hi Rosanna and go to the funeral. But my siblings were there. They kept working. They kept doing their thing. They were waiting. They saved their time to grieve for the funeral. As if that's something you can do. Apparently we believe that we can. 3 days. And the repercussions of that for my siblings were deeply grave and absolute. That they did not have time to grieve. And so that grief is there, unmetabolized. It has had detrimental consequences. And that is only right now. This is with this one part of the grief of their lives. As I've shared with you guys before, I have complex compound trauma, and I'm one of 4 siblings. So watching that and seeing it exactly what the consequences of unmetabolized grief are in my own family right now, today, modern day today, makes it even more important to me to talk about what I'm talking about. That grief is important. It's a skill set. There has to be made room for it, at least in our own, with the privacy of our own bodies, to allow, to hold, to practice that grief that's in there. is so necessary for our own individual humanity. It is also the way we find our way back to each other. Allow it to bring us to our knees, belly and face to the ground, all the way in. All the way in. It will change you. You need the change that it has for you. You need that to be alive. I love you too, Ingrid. And I hadn't realized how much of a friend grief has been to me my whole life until this. Right? It was like open all these understandings of like grief has been carrying me and holding me and waiting right there. Right there. She was like, I've been waiting. I've been waiting. I'm right here. I've got you. Come home. Come home. Come and feel this. Come home to yourself. She had always been waiting. Patiently. No conditions. No demands. Just waiting. Holding. Knowing that there would be a movement at some point. Even if it was the moment I took my last breath. I will love my other. So we've been taught to be afraid of grief, of each other in grief. We've been taught to be afraid of expressions of grief. We've been taught to tell other people their grief is too much, right? Like some of the most callous things were like, well, when are you going to get over it? Like, why are you still talking about it? My question is, why aren't you still talking about the people you lost in love? What's happening? What happened to you? I know what happened to me. I know how I got to be grief illiterate, grief starved. I know how I got here, but what the hell happened to you that you think you can talk to me like that while I'm talking about my grief? What the hell happened to us? The hell happened to us? I know what happened to us. But this is the question I ask when the callousness happens. That, sometimes an anonymous person, dies. I'm touching on things metaphorically right now. And people are like, oh, well, I feel it. There's not a life that is lost that I don't feel that loss. I don't have to know somebody to grieve their loss. Myth. I have to know them. I have to care about them. No, you don't. Yes, being protected from our own grief. Kids are not allowed to grieve. Yeah. It's so hard to hear others say that I need to get over this to themselves as well. Yes, it's an indoctrination over, eons. That's not true. Eons is a bit long. It's not ancient history. It's only about 5,000 to 8,000 years old. This very, unnatural idea about grief. Because when we have culture around grief, mass incidences of violence are impossible. But if we keep, the Roman Empire in Europe, I'm just going to obliterate all these tribes, all these cultures, all these food, all these people, all this stuff. Just keep doing it and assimilating and assimilating and assimilating and not giving any time, space, or breath to grief. 3 days. If you work in corporate America, you get 3 days. 3 days, and you gotta be back to normal. Don't talk about it anymore. And if it's a person that's been in your life your whole life, what a fucking horrible thing to say. If it's a person you met yesterday and you had a great lunch with them, what a fucking horrible thing to say to somebody. As if human life is not valuable. Every single one of them isn't valuable. That's what starts happening. It's a dehumanization process. And the stealing and oppression and suppression of grief is part of that dehumanization process. And then we dehumanize ourselves. I should just get over my grief. I don't know why it's bothering me anymore. Every time I talk to somebody like this, who says this to me in a session, I start to cry. I grieve that dysfunction conditioning that is coming out of their mouth that is hurting them. I grieve for that. Fuck. There's so much callousness in that. There's so much meanness. There's so much inconsideration for human life. Your own and that of the person that you lost, or the animal, or the tree, or the land, or the people. Grief encompasses everything that we love and care about. It makes life worth living. Thank you for the emojis. Thank you guys for being here. As I said in the beginning, I think this is the 4th or 5th in a series that I have done, that I'm doing for my launch. If you want to go look at them, they're all about an hour long. They're free here on my Facebook. And there's no obligation to purchase from me what I'm launching. But if you are interested, please PM me for the details. Grief is the 3rd module in the Simple Circle Year in Maturity. And we work on it, and we delve into it, and we do it. And if not, what I hope you walk away from being here with me today is more trust in your grief. Trusting yourself and trusting your grief. And allowing yourself to be human. More and more and more in every moment of your life. So there were some pretty massive tech glitches for those of you that stuck with it for me today, with me, all the way. Thank you for being here. For those of you who have watched this, days later, thank you. Time is something that we can't get back. Our lives are these finite, beautiful blips in the ocean of humanity. And the fact that you take your time that you cannot get back to be here with me in this conversation, live or otherwise, means so very much to me. And I appreciate the honor of having you with me for this time. Thank you. And I'll see you guys on the other side.